So I'm on.
These episode money's okay.
Yeah. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this workshop for us this morning. And also welcome to those of you who are online in this conference. This is the Synod Climate Action Conference, Future Direction. And we're looking forward to this time together. My name is Ali Moni Kamoepeau. I'm a minister of the Uniting Church in Australia. Currently, I'm in placement with the Mission Enablement Team at Uniting Mission and Education as a mission facilitation consultant. One of my passion is climate action, and this is very close to my heart, knowingly that where I was born and grew up in Tonga, sea rise level is really heartbreaking. And several years ago, some of the most damaging cyclone has gone through the islands and destroy a lot of the islands. So the concern of climate change is close to my heart. As we begin our workshop this morning, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owner of this land, the Burra Madakal people, or the Darug Nation, their elders past, present, and emerging. We give thanks to God for them and their hospitality in sharing this great Southland with us, the second and third people in this nation. Also, where you are at, we respect elders past, present, and future, and ask that we journey together in grace and mercy. This morning is a great privilege of mine to introduce to you our first speaker for today. Mr. Maina Talia was born and raised in Vaitupu, Tuvalu. Because of his strong link to his community and his people, Mr. Talia continues to be the voice for his community and his beloved country on the issue of climate justice, an indigenous issue at the United Nations at the regional level. Mr. Talia was among the very few Pacific brothers and sisters who were highly involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The local communities and indigenous people platform from its infancy state, adoption and its operationalization. He's currently a full-time PhD candidate at the Charles Stewart University, researching on the issue of climate justice, and Tuakoi, neighbor from Sri Dratakdori Muna or Tefale, indigenous knowledge, biblical and also geopolitical of climate change. Great person to speak on this. Are you my neighbor? Please welcome Mr. Maina Talia.
Thank you so very much, Moni, and greetings to you all. Especially great to see Professor Paul joining us online, and the rest of the team who are also joining us through Zoom. I only have 10 minutes to do my presentation. in this sort of presentation, I will not talk about the vulnerability of us to climate change, but I will ask Senfo to play a short clip on how vulnerable we are. And then I'll start with the second part of my presentation.
Just escape. Just escape. Just grab some of who's
Is it showing up?
Let's actually show we just don't have the sound.
Okay.
And yeah, you can put it up.
Yeah, okay. As
We'll come back to it, sorry.
yeah, it's all right. We'll do the clip later on, but it was supposed to come before the second part of the presentation. But anyway, those who deny to accept climate change or climate emergency should come and stay with me in Tuvalu and share the same experience with us. You have seen the challenge. Well, we haven't seen the clip yet. Our contribution to the issue of climate change is almost next to nothing. Nonetheless, we suffer at the expense of others. The language of neighbor seldom used in the United Nations climate change meeting or the COP statements, even at the United Nations General Assembly. It has never been a central focus of climate change and negotiation. Very seldom we get to find the Pacific scholars talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan in relation to climate change. The geopolitical crisis of what is now reckoned to be climate change or climate emergency invariably raises the critical question to do with who is my neighbor. The reason for such lies partly in the way in which the language of neighbor presupposes a common humanity. The very nature of global reports coming from international conferences, from Kyoto to Paris Agreement, all presumes that climate change is planetary. It is a concern of all that requires a globalized need to act now. Therefore, our understanding of neighbor must go beyond the traditional understanding of someone who lives next door to us. It must and should be transboundary. The parable of the Good Samaritan poses a serious challenge for all of us today. Martin Luther Jr. challenged the prevailing structures of the time by asking the following questions. Let me quote him. So I can imagine the first question, which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? Then the Good Samaritan came by, and by the very nature of his concern, reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Thus, the priest and the Levite found a tension between serving a loving God and loving neighbor, and they chose to be loyal to the temple and the law. They were afraid of breaking the Mosaic law. They do not have any social ethics. Their moral responsibilities could not extend beyond the temple. By reversal, the Samaritan asked, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? The letter poses a pertinent question that is relevant to our time. Let me rephrase the question. If I do not stop to help Tuvalu and other low-lying atolls, what will happen to them? What will happen to our Mother Earth, who is being beaten, stripped, raped, and robbed, and left half dead by neo-capitalists in their race for accumulation of wealth? The Samaritan challenged the prevailing logic. He was not supposed to touch the religious Jew. By helping a Jew, he could be excluded from his own community. But he showed compassionate love, which we identify as the love of God. In a situation where common sense is needed to apply without any consultation, Desmond Tutu reminded us, if you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has his foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, a mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. A neutral theology is a homeless theology, in words of CSR. It's a theology without a foundation. In other words, the role of neutrality played by the priest and the Levite helps justify the status quo. And this is the same game of silence our Tuakoi, our neighbor, are playing in the context of climate change. They continue to see the unprecedented rate of adversity of climate change and the frequency of intensified tropical cyclones, drought, water salinity, king tide, increase of ocean temperature, and yet they cannot make a stop, nor to make some fundamental structural changes to ensure that when a specific man comes from Tuvalu to Australia to seek refuge, does not get sent to a refugee camp. In fact, the reality that without radical reorganization of our economic system frameworks that rob Mother Earth and ability to sustain life, we will not find answer to the prevailing problems created by climate change. Nevertheless, in the mind of the Samaritan, solidarity has no color, no border. Since he is a victim of religious racism and religious segregation, he learned how to be in solidarity with the victimized. This is a lesson from who are victimized now by climate change and sea level rise. Who is the neighbor? Is it the people with religious rightness by enjoying the loot of capitalist system who are represented by the priests and the Levites, or the people who are victims of structural injustice? This is the same question that we should challenge ourselves and our churches today. Challenge our churches to stop praying, stop hiding behind prayers, but try to act. Our churches cannot remain silent while Mother Earth is being raped, robbed, and left bleeding on the side of the road. Thank you. If the clip is okay now, can we put it on? Where I come from. That's the island where I'm from. That was during Cyclone Tam in 2015. Yeah, I think you can. Turn it up. And we can share the link with, so we can give Professor Olu the chance to. Thank you so much for. But that wasn't during cyclone time in 2015, especially on my island. Sorry, I was meant to introduce Tuvalu and so forth, but it was something that's supposed to come after the clip. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to the presentation. Happy to engage further.
Thank you, Mina, for that challenging presentation of Are You My Neighbor? To speak to us this morning on reweaving the ecological map, Reverend Professor Dr. Upolu Lumava'ai is Professor of Theology and Ethics and Principal of the Pacific Theological College in Suva, Fiji. He is an internationally renowned publisher, scholar on Pacific relationality, eco-relational theology, relational hermeneutics, and chief editor of the Pacific Relational Renaissance series that revives Pacific relational philosophies and ways of knowing and being that offer holistic alternatives to colonial mainstream development narratives. He is the Ozenia Chair of the Oxford Institute of Methodist Theological Studies of the Oxford University and Chair of the convener of the Pacific Philosophy Conference series. He's a member of the Expert Committee of the Education for Justice of the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes and Pacific Coordinator for the G20 Interfaith Summit. The World Council of Churches recently endorsed his initiative for eco-relational theology as a way forward for the global church to effectively address issues of climate change and ecological destruction. To speak to us this morning from Suva, Fiji, on reweaving the ecological map, Reverend Professor Upolu Vai. Welcome.
Thank you to the organizing committee for this kind invitation. and also the honor to give me to me to present this reweaving the ecological mat. Sorry, my voice is a little bit down because of the flu. And I apologize if you hear some of the noises on the road because I'm in my little garden house because the power is out in the whole of Suva area. I will be speaking this morning about the reweaving the ecological mat, but I would like to acknowledge first my brother Maina and the wonderful presentation to set the stage for us this morning, especially the raw images of how unneighborly we have become in relation to our economies and geopolitics, and the expense of that unneighborly activities or unneighborly behavior on our small island neighbors such as Tuvalu and many others in around the Pacific. If I could ask Stafford to, if you could share the PowerPoint, please. Right. Second slide, please. No, go to the first one. Yeah, that's the one. Second one. Yeah. The REM objective, the reweaving the ecological mat objective, is for Pacific churches to articulate and drive an alternative development mandate to address ecological and development issues to ensure the ecological well-being and wholeness of their people and communities. So number one is that REM is a Pacific Churches initiative initiated by Pacific Theological College in 2017 in collaboration with the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Oceania Center of the University of the South Pacific. Second is that REM is organized around the need for a radical ecological justice-oriented mission for churches to address the now recognized ecological and climate crisis for the health situation of the people, to the degradation of the environment that is emerging in the Pacific region. Three is that REM is a self-determination strategy aimed at addressing the challenges arising from the ecological and climate crisis in the region. Changes in lifestyle spurred on by consumerism and the more is better ethic of development not only cause environmental destruction and hence exacerbate climate changes, but also increasingly produces unhealthy economies and populations. The statistics on population health, poverty, depleting fish stocks, and overlocking of our forests are indicators of this ecological crisis. At the core of this ecological crisis is the loss of vision and understanding of the delicate interdependence of life, a vision that once guided and ensured the survival of Pacific Island generations for centuries. Fourth is that REM is a critique of the current development models, which aims to propose alternative models that are ground up and life-affirming, firmly grounded on community spiritualities and cultures of resilience. Next slide. The situational analysis is that REM came into being because of the lack of a Christian framework on development to assist churches to confidently engage on ecological and development issues. Two is that the progressive abandonment of indigenous and faith-based ecological frameworks as legitimate ways to deal with the ecological and climate crisis. 3 is a lack of priority given to spirituality, whether Christian or indigenous, in the dominant development narrative. 4, the lack of priority given to relationality, the understanding that the household of God is made up of multiple equal relationships that form the basis of thinking and life in every island communities, such as those in Oceania. 5, the lack of a multi-dimensional approach to development that acknowledges the inseparability of the sacred and secular, tangible and intangible, visible and invisible, for example. 6, the lack of development models that recognize specific cultural heritage and cultural well-being. And the last one is a lack of approaches that reunify the oikos triplets of ecology, economy, and oikomene. Next slide, please. So REM has the underpinning philosophy and basis of REM is the notion of home. This is based on the Pacific Church's new vision of the Pacific household of God, approved by the PCC Assembly, as well as Pacific Church leaders' meetings. The Pacific Churches agreed to shift from the unity in Christ narrative that has dominated Christian ecumenism and Christianity in the Pacific for centuries, since 1961, to the household of God in order to press further and press harder into saving the Pacific home, destroyed by rich multinational corporations and countries. The household philosophy puts emphasis on collective responsibilities to our common home. We believe in what we call a carried home, that the earth is us and we are the earth. The land is us and we are land. This home is inseparable from us and from the earth. And of course, because us as human beings are multidimensional, we carry with us this home every day. Second is the whole of life vision, that all of life is interconnected, running into each other, finding oneself in the other. Therefore, there is no compartmentalization of life. The current categorization that we have imposed on life, such as sacred and secular, has ramifications on how we should create whole of life approaches to issues such as climate change. And 3, holistic well-being, a life consciousness that has a dimension of everything. Ecology should be seen as a transversal that finds dimensions in everything else. Therefore, economic well-being, for example, is inseparable from ecological well-being. Next slide, please. So these are the REM indicators and focus. In 2017, REM started with the educational focus to assist to change the story of development. First, the churches and ecumenical organizations were called to adopt a revised development and ecological mandate through their governing bodies and request assistance to design community education materials for church groups and the schools they manage. B, then for church leaders and civil society leaders to advocate through media and discussions for ecologically sustainable development policies and changes to national development indicators with their governments. And the last one, B, C, the purpose is really to produce educational materials and then mobilize to lobby national governments to revisit and review national development strategies in the light of these sustainable ecological frameworks. However, in 2019, the REM focus shifted. And it shifted to developing a regional ecological framework for development, or what we call EFD, to give it a more practical outcome to influence local governments and policy frameworks. These include researching, drafting, and publishing the regional ecological framework, framework for development, and building solidarity and advocacy around it are the new focus. And we have discovered this in our journey with many communities around the region and governments, that the more and more we talk about REM, the more this ecological framework for development, an alternative ecological framework for development, has come up in many discussions. This publication of the EFD has already been produced, and I, on behalf of churches and partners, presented the copy of this EFD to the Central Committee for the 2050 strategy of the Pacific Islands Forum. And I did this in October last year, 2020. And C, two other publications that were presented also to the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat are the Ecological Economic Accounts Towards Intermediate Values, that offers an ecological accounting methodology to raise the equity of Pacific people as a whole. It does this by accounting for our vast biodiversity against environmental degradation and resource depletion, the loss of our ecological biodiversity, and leveraging the rise of the CO2 in the atmosphere against our ocean data. This is an alternative to GDP. The other publication is from the Deep, Pacific Voices for a New Story, that includes documenting voices to assist in creating a new development story or a climate story for the region. Next slide, please. Okay, let me go to the details right now, and perhaps starting with this slide, I need to give some recommendations and also some offer to assist the United Church in Australia in how we experience climate change in the region, and how the REM project came into being, and some of the experiences we have encountered. So strategic priorities: if we are to develop a radical and effective climate strategy from the churches and the community perspectives, I would offer the following priorities, at least from the experience of the REM project in Oceania, when we traveled around many islands in Oceania to offer the REM project. Next slide, please. First priority is spirituality. The recognition that Earth and universe is a sacred home, a household, organized into a certain Trinitarian and relational spirituality of interconnectedness, interlinking, and whole of life structure. This should be cross-cutting in all aspects of the climate strategy. From a Trinitarian relational perspective, climate change is not just a scientific, economic, or ecological issue. It is also a spirituality issue, because it touches on the very fabric of God's life with creation. And C, no climate security, there is no climate security without spiritual security. There's no well-being of the individual without the well-being of the whole. The visible cannot be healed unless the spiritual is healed. And I think this is very critical if we are to move forward to a climate strategy that takes spirituality as one of its strategic priority. Next slide, please. Culture, philosophies, and values. This is recognizing the role of culture in climate resilience. A, cultural heritage, which refers to the protection of who we are as islanders, as people of the land, our philosophies and values that connect us and provide empowerment, well-being, and hope. B is cultural innovation. This refers to how we are charting our destinations and priorities, probing a new pathway and creating new climate cultures firmly grounded on life-affirming community values. And 3, cultural well-being. This refers to the analysis of our past mistakes and how we could move forward in measuring our progress as we journey through climate uncertainties. Next slide. So I come to, I think, one of the most important priorities that we need to look at in our climate strategies, and that is language. First, is the recognition that we have diverse, multiple languages that constitute Oceania. And when I say Oceania, it includes New Zealand, Australia as well. Within every language contains the dynamics of community resilience and well-being that cannot be captured in the English language normally employed in climate consultations or climate policy frameworks. Second, B, climate frameworks were developed according to the aspirations of a different context that either do not work in contexts outside of their origin or do not take into consideration the relational dynamics and cultures that are central to the survival of other contexts such as Oceania. And we have seen a lot of these imposed or foreign climate frameworks or climate strategies that are currently imposed on our communities. And 3 is that terminologies, C, terminologies such as carbon emission, resources, mitigation, adaptation, carbon footprint, methane, for example, are sometimes confusing when they reach the grassroots communities because they are loaded with scientific and philosophical technicalities that cannot be easily understood by our ordinary minds in our ordinary communities. The loss in translation is another huge issue in our fight against climate change. The grassroots are unaware of what is happening in institutions because we are speaking different languages on the same issue. For example, island communities have their own language and way of adaptation that are more communal in nature. And some of those adaptation methodologies can only be captured if we capture their language well. The challenge is how could we link science and indigenous knowledge and language to constructively create a holistic climate strategy? Next slide, please. The other priority is resilience. Climate strategies should recognize the importance of community resilience. For the sake of decolonization and decompartmentalizing our climate strategies, these strategies should aim as much as possible to identify cheap and sustainable, locally appropriate climate models, tested and lived throughout many centuries by our local communities. Normally, the climate strategies overlook these important homegrown community models. B, the victim's approach, couched in the language of vulnerable Pacific, sinking islands, or drowning people, sometimes overlook the resilience work already conducted by communities on the ground who address the crisis without the need of any financial assistance. We find this often in our small island communities, especially in relation to our climate initiatives that are currently produced throughout the region. 3, resilience and relationality. Resilience can only be understood well in the light of relationships in community, at least from the perspective of relationality. The power of resilience is in community cooperation, in the people, in community, not in strategies or in frameworks or in policies. The people should be first in any climate strategy. Communities should take center stage in any climate initiative. Last slide, please. Next slide. The last slide is community, priority on community. Churches cannot do this alone. We cannot just focus on work alone on climate initiative or climate strategies, and then expect the governments and others to adhere. We need a community-based climate model. We need an ecumenical and relational strategy to work together with civil societies, government sectors, and grassroots communities, and many different communities such as scientists and youth. This, at least from the perspective of REM, the REM project, that it is only in this intersection of experience as well as knowledge that we are able to bring together some of the projects such as the ecological framework for development. B, we really need to move away from the top-down hierarchical strategy that is continually adopted by climate change models. At least this is the experience from the REM project. In order to adopt a spanning boundaries ground-up approach, one that starts with peoples and communities, not with frameworks and policies. And the last one is that because of the experience of REM, PTC is transitioning in the next 3 years towards a Pacifica Communities University, where all our educational and development models will be based and informed by philosophies, theologies, and relational values of communities, even the adaptation methods and other methods as well, and models, especially the grassroots communities. This is a huge shift away from the dominant top-down educational model that is still theoretical, classroom-based, and institutionally centered. Here in this shift and this transition, the center of learning shifts to the communities. The communities determine what learning is, what strategy is, what initiatives we should take in relation to development and in relation to issues such as climate change. REM, or the Reweaving the Ecological Map, will continue in one of the schools of the university, which is the School of Ecology and Resilience Development. And if you look at this, we are no longer using the word sustainable development, but we are opting to use the word resilience development in the shift to the new university because it focuses more on community cooperation and community well-being. As the word sustainable has been fashionable around the world, that it has become economized and politicized to an extent of benefiting cooperation at the expense of communities in the region. So that is a contribution from the REM project, and I wish all the best to Uniting Church of Australia and its climate change strategy, and hope that this contribution will contribute to at least some of the areas for your strategic priorities. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for this great opportunity and honor to share with you the REM project of the Pacific Churches. Binaka.
Thank you, Reverend Professor Dr. Upolu Mama'ai, for such a very comprehensive and challenging presentation this morning that will allow us in the Uniting Church to take action, not only here in this country, but also in Oceania, that it's including every islands in the Pacific. Thank you also to Maina Talia for presenting to us this morning. Now that I think we have about 4 minutes for questions, 4 minutes for questions. And if there's anyone in the room who wish to ask questions, those of you online, can you please put it on the chat, and Stafford will bring it to me or bring it to us so that you can be involved in the question and answer phase. Any question? To both Maina and also Professor Vai.
So I was thinking it was probably more to Professor Vai, but
Yep.
Mine has a response. I guess I was thinking, how have these ideas been received by people beyond the churches within the Pacific? I'm thinking particularly in terms of government, in terms of embracing the kind of the ideas that are coming out of REM.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In most of the consultations and workshops that we conduct around the region, the governments as well as heads of churches and civil societies are involved. So for example, when we went to Papua New Guinea to take the REM to Papua New Guinea, ministers of the cabinet as well as members of parliament were there present in the REM, and they were very much appreciative of the new radical, and in fact it was in BNG that we got the idea of how we could work together with governments, especially mobilizing our own resources, and how could our message reach the policymakers. That's why the EFD, or the Ecological Framework for Development, came up, because more and more we talk about the REM, the more I think the governments need something practical, something realistic from us, the churches. And that is why we put together this EFD, and which has been presented to the Pacific Island Forum Strategic Committee for the 2050 strategy. So in most of the cases that we went to, I think the governments are more appreciative, with, of course, a lot of other challenges that are involved. But it seems like this notion of home, or this notion of household that underpins the REM project is more and more accepted and endorsed by governments in the region. Of course, the challenge is how to bring this within the institutionalized framework that governments work according. But that is still in transition and is still in progress. But at the moment, the collapse or the deterioration of regionalism, I think this notion of Pacific Household of God and the home idea has become more and more important and more than ever. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Perhaps while others are waiting with their questions, Dr. Vai, the Uniting Church in Australia are very much into taking action now and into the future. And that is what this conference is about, is to create a space where we can find out some action to do. In your presentation, I really appreciate the initiative that you're taking. What I'm asking, what are some practical action that local churches in the Pacific are already adhered to or doing that will assist us in Australia to be part of that?
Thank you for that. I think that question would perhaps would go more into the Pacific Conference of Churches Secretariat rather than ourselves. But what I know is that some of the churches like the Methodist Church in Fiji, as well as the Methodist Church in Samoa, are putting together a climate strategy, a development climate strategy for climate change. It's in, I think, most of those are in their infant stages. Other churches are sort of carefully navigating into this, not rushing into this idea. But of course, they endorse the importance of all the churches taking action in relation to this. But I think the project, the REM project, is really to lobby the government, the local national governments, on how to take action together with the churches. So this is sort of a regional action-based strategy. When it comes to local strategies, I think the secretary will be appropriate to answer some of these questions. But for the regional level, in relation to national governments and their strategies, I think we are moving towards working together with them. And I think that is the challenge that we are facing right now, is whether local churches will take action rather than just endorsing the household or endorsing the strategic plan that we have put up.
Thank you. Thank you. One more. From the, is there anything from the online? David, no, nothing from the room? Okay.
Well, I just for mine, how would he characterize the Australian nation as a neighbour to the Pacific at the moment? How are we going in terms of our neighbourliness or not from a Pacific perspective?
It's a very challenging question, because I think in Madrid 2 years ago, I organized an event in Madrid, Spain, for the Conference of the Parties. And I invited James Pakuan, Reverend James Pakuan from the Pacific Conference of Churches, and our former Prime Minister and former President of Kiribati, to talk on the concept of neighbor. Am I not your neighbor? And we got a response from Morrison the next day to our event. And it was broadcast, and also a written piece was sent to us. Especially on the issue of neighbor, I mean, you have seen Australia have done quite a fair bit in helping us, and in terms of, especially in Tuvalu, the foreign support that they have given us. But all we are asking Australia is to limit their carbon emission, and especially on the opening of new coal mines. I think that's the biggest challenge that we've been advocating for in the past years. And I think that could be also a practical initiative that the church here in Australia should also look into it, on how best we can work together as churches and also NGOs and other faith-based organizations to make noise and also push the government of Australia to rethink their priorities, especially when it comes to carbon emission and coal mining.
If I would, if I would add to Maina's comment, I really appreciate the initiative done by the Uniting Church in relation to this, and involving the island communities in the consultations as well in the workshops. I think that mentality is already neighborly in its own structure. The idea of Australia as part of Oceania is still debatable. The reconstruction or the decolonization of the word Oceania and Pacific in many of the writings and literature around the region is that New Zealand and Australia are still part of Oceania. The issue is whether Australia wants to be part of Oceania. Because in the geopolitics arena, is that the only reason why the government of Australia wants to be part of Oceania is the geopolitics and the strategic geopolitics that is involved, especially in relation to funding, in relation to China, in relation to other. So, and I think Australia is more into the first world rather than to Oceania. If I would put this really honestly from an island perspective. But if the churches stand on this ground and say that we are part of Oceania, then of course we can still work together, given the lapse of the Australian government to address issues of climate change and the reality that we in the islands are faced. So I think it's a very important question to readdress again in other forums. We can also readdress again, but it really depends on Australia, whether they want to be part of us or not.
Thank you so much. That is a question that we will take to the forum within the conference in itself today. So I think it would be good to bring that to the whole conference to answer from the Australian perspectives.